Fine particles of dirt spiraled lazily around the worn timber steps of Henderson's Mercantile, lifted by breezes that carried whispered tales from the far-off peaks. Against the rough-hewn post, Sarah May crouched in a small bundle, her tiny figure creating barely a hint of shade in the declining afternoon light. Her garment, originally as azure as a cloudless day, had dulled to the shade of ancient sorrow, stitched and repaired so frequently that its first cloth existed more in recollection than substance. Multiple days had elapsed since her last substantial nourishment, and her belly had ceased its furious complaints long ago, resigned to a persistent emptiness she'd become skilled at disregarding. Redemption. Creek's residents rushed by with lowered gazes, occasionally stealing glances filled with compassion that never quite converted to assistance. She'd come to understand not to anticipate much from their furtive stares and hushed discussions. The outsider spotted her before she became aware of him. He stood impressively tall, aged like ancient hide, possessing eyes resembling tempest clouds and palms that revealed decades of handling leather and metal. His footwear created gentle sounds against the timber boards as he drew near, rowels chiming a soft tune that somehow differed from the sharp clatter most gentlemen produced while walking. He stopped in front of her, his silhouette casting across her small shape like refuge she hadn't requested, yet desperately required. When she eventually raised her head, meeting his stare with eyes too mature for her youthful features, he witnessed something there that caused his chest to constrict with familiarity. It bore the expression of someone who had discovered prematurely that existence could be harsh and uncaring. "Young lady," he spoke, his tone as soft as dawn precipitation. "For whom are you waiting?" Sarah May examined him thoroughly, the manner an untamed creature might assess a possible danger or deliverance. Most grown-ups who troubled themselves to address her desired something, or perhaps worse, they wished to scold her regarding appropriate conduct and the significance of locating her relatives. This gentleman's voice contained neither condemnation nor artificial compassion, merely authentic interest colored with something that could have been comprehension. "My father," she eventually replied, her voice scarcely louder than a murmur. "He promised he'd return for me once he secured employment. He mentioned it would merely be several days, perhaps a week at the longest." The stranger's jaw clenched almost unnoticeably. He'd witnessed excessive portions of this region to trust in fortunate accidents or joyful reunions that required months to occur. "How much time has passed, child?" he asked. 3 weeks, possibly 4. Sarah May's digits fidgeted with her worn dress. "But he's returning. He gave his word he would." The gentleman gazed down at her with eyes that had observed their portion of shattered promises and deserted youngsters. His identity was Thomas Whitmore, though most people addressed him as Tom, and he'd been wandering from settlement to settlement for nearly 5 years, since his personal world had crumbled around him like a fragile structure in a storm. He bore his personal specters, his individual assembly of possibilities that might have existed and obligations that should have been fulfilled. Yet something regarding this small girl awakened something within him that he'd believed was permanently extinguished. "What do they call you?" he inquired, positioning himself on the steps next to her, near enough to provide solace, yet distant enough to prevent causing her anxiety. "Sarah May Patterson," she responded, and then, because her mother had instilled proper etiquette in her, despite the world having since neglected to demonstrate any to her, she continued, "What's your name?" "Mr. Tom Whitmore." He retrieved a piece of hardtack from his pocket, splitting it in two and presenting her the larger half. "You appear as though you could benefit from this more than I can." Sarah May's eyes expanded, and momentarily her cautious demeanor fractured, exposing the urgent hunger underneath. She accepted the offered nourishment with shaking hands, attempting not to consume it too rapidly, striving to preserve the dignity her mother had instructed was more precious than gold. While she ate, Tom observed the settlement surrounding them. Redemption Creek represented the type of location that existed because someone had determined it was sufficiently distant from civilization to begin anew, yet not so remote that they couldn't obtain provisions when necessary. It possessed a chapel, a tavern, a mercantile, and adequate dwellings to consider itself a community, but it lacked the warmth that transformed a location into home. "Sarah May," he said cautiously, "when did you last have a proper meal? Something warm, I mean." She pondered the inquiry seriously, as though fearful that confessing the reality would somehow make her father's absence more genuine. "Mrs. Henderson provided me some broth yesterday, or perhaps it was the previous day. The days blend together when you're waiting." Tom felt something twist within his chest. He'd existed as a wanderer for years now, traveling from town to town, accepting whatever labor he could discover, remaining just long enough to earn sufficient funds to proceed to the next place. He convinced himself it was liberty, this unanchored existence. But observing Sarah May, he recalled what it felt like to have people relying on you, to possess a reason to remain in one location and construct something enduring. "Tell me about your father," he requested. "What type of work was he seeking?" Sarah May's expression brightened, slightly, the way children's faces do when they discuss the people they cherish. "Papa's exceptionally skilled with horses. He can tame the most wild mustang, make them trust him simply by speaking gently and remaining patient. Before Mama passed away, we owned a small ranch outside of town, and folks would bring their difficult horses to Papa. He claimed that horses and people aren't very different, that they both simply need someone to understand them." The image she described was becoming clearer to Tom, and none of it appeared promising. A gentleman who worked with horses, departing his daughter alone while he searched for work, would have found employment quickly in a territory where skilled horsemen were valued like precious metal. The fact that Sarah May continued waiting meant one of two possibilities. Either her father had perished, or he had decided that single parenthood's responsibilities exceeded what he could manage. Tom had witnessed both situations unfold too frequently during his travels across the frontier. Death was commonplace out here, where a serpent's bite, tumbling from a horse, or simple misfortune could terminate a life instantly. But abandonment was equally common, perhaps more so, because it required a deliberate decision to abandon everything that held significance. "Sarah May," he said, selecting his words carefully, "how long do you intend to wait here?" "As long as necessary," she replied with the fierce resolve that only children can summon when defending their final hope. "Papa always honors his promises. Always." Tom looked at her, this small girl with soil beneath her fingernails and hope still glowing in her eyes, and felt something transform inside him. Perhaps it was recognition of his own stubborn devotion to people who'd never earned it. Perhaps it was the memory of his own daughter, lost to illness, and his failure to locate a physician in time. Or perhaps it was simply basic human decency that he'd been attempting to bury under years of cynicism and self-imposed solitude. "Well then," he said, standing up and brushing off his trousers, "if you're going to wait, you might as well wait somewhere comfortable. How about we get you a substantial meal and a place to rest tonight? Your father will still be able to locate you in the morning." Sarah May looked up at him with suspicion that shattered his heart. She'd learned to be cautious of adult promises, he realized. Learned that kindness often arrived with conditions that a child couldn't fulfill. "Why would you assist me?" she asked. "You don't even know me." Tom contemplated several responses, all of them truthful, but none of them complete. He could tell her about his own daughter, about the guilt that pursued him like a shadow, about how helping others sometimes felt like the only method to make amends for past failures. Instead, he settled on the simplest truth. "Because you need assistance, and I'm here to provide it." It required some discussion with Mrs. Henderson at the boarding house to secure Sarah May a room and meals for a week, with Tom paying in advance and promising to cover any additional costs. The woman was suspicious initially, wondering about Tom's intentions and questioning the appropriateness of a strange man accepting responsibility for an unrelated child, but something in his demeanor, or maybe the way Sarah May's eyes illuminated at the prospect of a genuine bed and regular meals, convinced her to agree. That evening, as Sarah May slept in an actual bed for the first time in weeks, Tom sat on the boarding house porch and attempted to understand what he'd gotten himself into. He'd come to Redemption Creek seeking work, planning to stay just long enough to earn money for supplies and then continue to the next town. He hadn't planned on acquiring a 7-year-old responsibility with eyes that reminded him too much of his own losses. The following morning brought no sign of Sarah May's father, but it did bring an opportunity. Jake Morrison, who owned the largest ranch outside of town, was looking for someone to break a string of Mustangs he'd acquired from a traveling horse trader. The work was dangerous but well-paying, exactly the kind of job Tom usually sought when he needed to rebuild his stake and move on. He found Sarah May at the general store, back on her familiar perch on the steps, scanning the horizon for a figure that Tom was increasingly certain would never appear. "Good morning, little miss," he said, settling down beside her. "Sleep well?" "Yes, sir. Thank you for the room and the food." Her manners were impeccable, a testament to parents who'd raised her right before the world took them away. "Papa should be here soon. I can sense it." Tom nodded, not wanting to challenge her hope directly. "Sarah May, I need to ask you something, and I want you to think real hard before you answer. If your papa doesn't come today, or tomorrow, or even next week, what would you like to do?" The question hung between them like morning mist, delicate and easily disturbed. Sarah May's small hands twisted in her skirt, and Tom could see her wrestling with possibilities she didn't want to acknowledge. "He's coming," she said finally, but her voice lacked its previous conviction. "I know you believe that," Tom said gently, "and maybe he will, but just in case, maybe we should think about other options. I got offered some work here in town, breaking horses for Mr. Morrison's ranch. Good work, steady pay. I could stay around for a while, make sure you're taken care of while we wait." Sarah May looked at him with a mixture of hope and fear. Adults who made promises often broke them, but adults who abandoned children were even worse. The fact that this stranger was offering to stay, to wait with her, seemed too good to be true. "Why would you do that?" she asked. Tom was quiet for a long moment, watching the dust devils dance in the street and trying to find words for feelings he'd kept buried for years. "I had a daughter once," he said finally, "about your age. She died of a fever while I was away working, trying to earn money to buy medicine for her mama. I wasn't there when she needed me most." He paused, swallowing against the familiar tightness in his throat that came whenever he talked about Lucy. "I can't bring her back, but maybe I can make sure another little girl doesn't have to face the world alone." Sarah May considered this with the seriousness that children bring to life-changing decisions. "What if Papa comes back and can't find me? Then we'll make sure everyone in town knows where you are and where you've gone. We'll leave word at the general store, the saloon, the church. If your papa comes looking, he'll find you." It was a practical solution, but Tom could see that Sarah May was struggling with more than logistics. She was being asked to choose between hope and reality, between the father she remembered and the life she might have if she stopped waiting for him. "I don't want to stop believing in him," she whispered. "You don't have to," Tom said. "But believing in someone doesn't mean you have to put your whole life on hold waiting for them. Sometimes the best way to honor the people we love is to keep living, keep growing, keep becoming the person they'd want us to be." Over the next few days, Tom began working with Morrison's Mustangs while Sarah May continued her vigil at the general store. But something had changed in her posture, in the way she watched the horizon. Hope was still there, but it was tempered now with the beginning of acceptance. Tom proved to have the same gentle touch with horses that Sarah May had described in her father. He worked patiently with each animal, never forcing, always listening, building trust, one quiet moment at a time. Word spread quickly through the town about the stranger who could calm the wildest Mustang with nothing but patience and understanding. Sarah May began spending her afternoons at the ranch, watching Tom work. She had an intuitive understanding of horses that amazed both Tom and Morrison, and it became clear that her father had taught her well before circumstances forced them apart. "She's got the gift," Morrison told Tom one evening as they watched Sarah May gently brush a mare that had been wild and fearful just days before. "Rare to see it in someone so young." Tom nodded, feeling a familiar pride that he thought he'd lost forever when Lucy died. Her father trained her well. "About that," Morrison said carefully, "I've been asking around about Robert Patterson, man who matches your description of Sarah May's father." Tom felt his stomach tighten. "What did you find out?" "He was here all right, about 6 weeks ago. Stayed at the boarding house for 3 days, looking for work." Morrison's expression was grim. "Found it too. Man named Hendricks offered him a job breaking horses for a spread up north. Good money, steady work, and Patterson took the job. Left town the next morning, told Mrs. Henderson he was going to send for his daughter once he got settled. Morrison paused, watching Sarah May with something that might have been pity. That was 5 weeks ago. Hendricks' spread is only 2 days' ride from here. The implications hit Tom like a physical blow. Sarah May's father hadn't died in some tragic accident or gotten lost trying to find work. He'd found exactly what he was looking for, and he'd chosen not to come back for his daughter. Maybe he'd convinced himself it was temporary, that he'd send for her soon. Maybe he'd decided that she was better off without him. Either way, the result was the same. Sarah May had been abandoned by the one person she trusted most. Tom looked at the little girl, still patiently brushing the mare and humming softly under her breath, and felt rage burning in his chest like a prairie fire. What kind of man left his child sitting on store steps, waiting for a reunion that would never come? But anger wouldn't help Sarah May, and Tom had learned long ago that the world was full of people who failed to live up to their responsibilities. The question now wasn't why Robert Patterson had abandoned his daughter, but what Tom was going to do about it. That night, after Sarah May had gone to bed, Tom sat in Morrison's kitchen and told him everything. The rancher listened in silence, occasionally nodding or shaking his head, but never interrupting. "So what are you thinking?" Morrison asked when Tom finished. "I'm thinking that little girl deserves better than sitting on those steps for the rest of her life, waiting for someone who's never coming back." "You going to tell her?" Tom was quiet for a long time, staring into his coffee cup, as if it held answers to questions he didn't know how to ask. "Not yet. Maybe not ever. Sometimes the truth does more harm than good." "And what about you? You planning to stay around permanent? Or is this just until you figure out what else to do with her?" It was the question Tom had been avoiding, the one that cut to the heart of everything he'd been running from for the past 5 years. Since Lucy's death, he'd told himself that attachment was weakness, that caring too much about anything or anyone was a luxury he couldn't afford. He'd built his life around the principle of never staying anywhere long enough to put down roots or make commitments that might break his heart all over again. But sitting in Morrison's kitchen, thinking about Sarah May's determined wait for a father who would never return, Tom realized that some commitments chose you rather than the other way around. He'd already crossed the line from stranger to protector. The question wasn't whether he cared about Sarah May. He'd answered that question the moment he bought her dinner and a room for the night. The question was whether he was brave enough to admit it. "I don't know," he said finally. "I never planned on staying anywhere this long." "Plans change," Morrison said. "And from what I've seen, that little girl has already decided you're worth trusting. Question is, are you going to prove her right?" The next morning brought news that changed everything. A rider came into town with word that Robert Patterson had been killed in a horse training accident up at the Hendricks Ranch, kicked in the head by a stallion he'd been trying to break, dead before he hit the ground. Tom felt the news like a physical weight settling on his chest. Sarah May's father was never coming back. Not because he'd chosen to abandon her, but because fate had made the choice for him. In some ways, it was better than deliberate abandonment, but in others it was worse. At least abandonment left room for anger, for the possibility of moving on and building something new. Death was final, absolute, offering no second chances or opportunities for redemption. Morrison found Tom sitting on the porch of the boarding house, staring at nothing and trying to figure out how to tell a 7-year-old girl that her world had just gotten a lot smaller and more uncertain. "You going to tell her?" Morrison asked, settling into the chair beside Tom's. "Have to, don't I? She's got a right to know. She's also got a right to be a child for a little while longer. Truth is, telling her won't change anything practical. Her situation is the same either way. She's an orphan who needs someone to take care of her. Only difference is whether she spends the rest of her life thinking her papa chose to leave her." Tom considered this, weighing the relative merits of truth and kindness. "What would you do?" "I'd think about what serves that little girl best, not what makes me feel better about keeping secrets." It was good advice, but it didn't make the decision any easier. Tom spat, and the rest of the day working with the horses and trying to imagine different ways the conversation might go. In the end, he decided on a version of the truth that might be kinder than the whole store. He found Sarah May at her usual spot on the general store steps, but something was different about her posture. She wasn't scanning the horizon with quite the same intensity, and when she looked up at Tom, her eyes held a new kind of sadness. "He's not coming back, is he?" she said before Tom could speak. The simple question hit him harder than he'd expected. He sat down beside her, trying to find words that would be honest without being cruel. "No, sweetheart, he's not." "Is he dead?" Tom was quiet for a moment, studying her face and trying to gauge how much truth she could handle. "Yes. There was an accident where he was working. I'm sorry, Sarah May. I'm so very sorry." Sarah May nodded slowly, as if she'd been expecting this news for days and was almost relieved to finally have it confirmed. "I knew," she said quietly. "Deep down, I think I knew. Papa would never have left me waiting if he could help it. Never." Tears started sliding down her cheeks, but she didn't make a sound. It was the kind of crying that spoke of grief too large for sobs, the quiet weeping of someone who'd lost the last anchor connecting them to the world they'd known. Tom reached over and pulled her into his arms, feeling her small body shake with sorrow that no child should have to bear alone. He held her while she cried, offering the only comfort he could give, his presence, his warmth, his promise that whatever came next, she wouldn't have to face it alone. When her tears finally slowed, Sarah May pulled back and looked at him with red-rimmed eyes that seemed older than they had that morning. "What happens to me now?" she asked. It was the question Tom had been dreading and anticipating in equal measure. The easy answer was that she'd become a ward of the territory, probably sent to an orphanage in one of the larger towns where she'd be fed and clothed and educated, but where she'd be just another lost child among dozens of others. The hard answer was that Tom could take responsibility for her, give her a home and a family, and all the stability he'd been running from since Lucy died. It would mean staying in Redemption Creek, putting down roots, building the kind of life that could be destroyed by forces beyond his control. "That depends," he said carefully. "I've got some options to consider, and so do you." Over the next hour, as the sun started its descent toward the western mountains, Tom laid out the possibilities. He could find her a good family to live with, people who had experience raising children and could give her the kind of normal childhood that a drifting cowboy couldn't provide. Or, if she wanted, he could apply to become her legal guardian, give her his name and his protection and whatever kind of future they could build together. "It wouldn't be easy," he told her honestly. "I don't know much about raising children, especially little girls. I don't have a permanent home and I can't promise you fancy clothes or expensive schooling, but I can promise that you'd never be alone again and that I'd do everything in my power to keep you safe and happy." Sarah May listened to all of this with the serious attention she brought to every important conversation, weighing each word as if her life depended on understanding every nuance. In a way, Tom supposed, it did. "Would you want me?" she asked finally. "Really want me? Not just feel sorry for me?" The question cut straight to the heart of everything Tom had been afraid to admit to himself. Want her? He already cared about her more than he'd cared about anything in years. She made him laugh with her serious observations about the world, impressed him with her gentle way with animals, and reminded him every day that there was still goodness and hope to be found in even the hardest circumstances. "Yes," he said simply. "I'd want you more than I've wanted anything in a very long time." "Then yes," Sarah May said, her voice steady despite the tears still drying on her cheeks. "I'd like that, Vi." And so it was that Tom Whitmore, who'd spent 5 years running from the possibility of caring too much about anything, found himself walking into the territorial courthouse in Redemption Creek to file papers that would make Sarah May Patterson into Sarah May Whitmore, his daughter, in every way that mattered. The legal process took several weeks, during which Tom and Sarah May settled into a routine that felt surprisingly natural. Tom worked with Morrison's horses during the day, while Sarah May attended the small school that served the children of Redemption Creek. In the evenings, they'd sit on the porch of the boarding house and talk about their day, about the horses, about the future they were building together, one conversation at a time. Morrison, recognizing Tom's value both as a horseman and as someone who might actually stay in Redemption Creek permanently, offered him a partnership in expanding the ranch's horse-breaking operation. It was the kind of opportunity Tom had never allowed himself to consider during his wandering years, a chance to build something lasting, to put down roots and become part of a community. "What do you think, Sarah May?" Tom asked her one evening as they watched the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and crimson. "You think you could be happy living on a ranch, helping me gentle horses and build something that might last?" Sarah May considered the question with her characteristic seriousness, then smiled with a brightness that Tom hadn't seen since the day he'd first found her waiting on those steps. "I think," she said, "that home isn't really a place anyway. It's the people who love you and want to keep you safe. And if you want to stay here and build something with Mr. Morrison, then this feels like home to me." 6 months later, Tom Whitmore stood in the main corral of Morrison Ranch, watching Sarah May work with a young filly that had been considered too skittish for human contact. The girl had inherited her father's gift with horses, but she'd added her own special touch, a patience and intuitive understanding that seemed to calm even the most fearful animals. "She's something special," Morrison said, joining Tom at the fence. "That she is," Tom agreed, feeling the kind of pride that he'd thought was lost to him forever. Sarah May looked up from her work with the filly and waved at the two men, her face bright with happiness and purpose. The transformation from the hollow-eyed waif Tom had found on those store steps was so complete that sometimes he had to remind himself that it had really happened, that this confident, laughing child was the same person who'd once sat waiting for a father who would never return. "You know," Morrison said, "I've been thinking about expanding our operation even more. There's talk of the territorial government wanting to start a program to train horses for the cavalry. Could be good business for a partnership that knows how to gentle wild things." Tom nodded, already seeing the possibilities. It would mean real prosperity, the kind of success that could secure Sarah May's future and give her opportunities he'd never dreamed of providing. More importantly, it would mean that the home they'd built together would have the stability and permanence that every child deserved. As the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and purple, Tom reflected on the strange series of events that had brought him to this moment. He'd come to Redemption Creek as a drifter looking for temporary work, planning to earn enough money to move on to the next town and the next job. Instead, he'd found a daughter, a home, and a future that felt more real and valuable than anything he'd ever built for himself. Sometimes, Tom thought, the best things in life weren't the ones you planned for or even the ones you thought you deserved. Sometimes they were the responsibilities that chose you, the connections that formed despite your best efforts to remain unattached, the love that crept up on you while you were busy trying to protect yourself from exactly that kind of vulnerability. Sarah May finished her work with the filly and came running over to the fence, her face flushed with excitement and accomplishment. "Did you see Papa Tom?" she said, using the name that had evolved naturally over their months together. "She let me brush her mane, and she didn't try to run away even once." "I saw," Tom said, reaching over the fence to ruffle her hair. "Your father would be proud of you, sweetheart. Real proud." And as they walked back toward the ranch house together, Tom realized that he'd finally found what he'd been looking for during all those years of wandering, even though he hadn't known he was searching for it. He'd found purpose, family, and the kind of peace that came from knowing that whatever challenges tomorrow might bring, he and Sarah May would face them together, as a family, in the place they'd chosen to call home.